Guide to Maupassant The Inn, translated from the French. Like all the other wooden inns scattered throughout the high Alps at the foot of glaciers, in the bare, rocky gorges between the snow-white mountain peaks, the Schwarenbach Inn offered shelter to travelers crossing the Gemmi Pass. It was open for 6 months of the year, inhabited by the family of Jean Hauser. Then, when the snow fell so heavily that it filled the gorge and completely blocked the descent to Loach, the Hausers, the women, the father, and 3 sons, would depart, leaving the building in the care of the old guide, Gaspard Hari, young Ulrich Kunze, and Sam, a huge mountain dog. The 2 men and the dog remained until spring in this snowbound prison, with nothing before their eyes but the gigantic white slope of the Baumhorn. On all sides they were surrounded by pale, gleaming peaks, imprisoned, buried under the snow, which rose up around them, enveloped them, weighed upon them, crushed the tiny house, piled onto the roof, reached to the very windows, and blocked the door. On that day, the Hauser family was preparing to return to Loach, for winter was approaching and the descent was becoming dangerous. Ahead, the 3 sons led 3 mules laden with baggage. The mother, Jean Hauser, and her daughter Louise mounted a 4th mule and also set off. The father walked behind them, accompanied by the 2 guards who were to escort the family to the point where the descent began. At first, they walked along the shore of a small, already frozen lake, nestled at the bottom of a vast hollow among the rocks that spread out before the inn. Then they emerged into a valley, white as a tablecloth, above which rose snow-covered peaks on all sides. The sun's rays poured abundantly onto this gleaming, frozen white desert, setting it ablaze with a dazzling yet cold flame. It seemed there were no signs of life in this ocean of snow, in this immense emptiness. Not a single movement, not one sound disturbed the profound silence. The young guide, Ulrich Kunze, a tall, lanky Swiss, left Hauser the father and old Gaspard Hari behind, and caught up with the mule carrying the women. The younger girl watched him approach and seemed to call to him with her sorrowful gaze. She was a small blonde with pale cheeks and hair as if faded by long life among the ice. Catching up to the mule, he laid a hand on its hindquarters and slowed his pace. Madame Hauser began talking to him, enumerating down to the last detail all the instructions concerning their winter vigil. He was staying up there for the first time, whereas old Hari had already wintered 14 times under the snow at the Schwarenbach Inn. Ulrich listened, but understood nothing, his gaze fixed incessantly on the girl. From time to time he would reply, "Yes, Madame Hauser," but his thoughts were far away, and his calm face remained impassive. They approached the Dauben Sea. A giant icy plain stretched out before them at the valley's bottom. To the right, the black, pointed rocks of the Daubenhorn rose upwards, and beside them, the massive fragments of the Lammern Glacier with a majestic Wildstrubel. As they neared the Gemmi Pass, where the descent to Loach begins, the vistas of the Valais Alps suddenly opened before them, separated from them by the deep, broad valley of the Rhone. In the distance, white peaks could be seen, uneven, jagged, sharp, glittering in the sunlight. The 2-horned Mischabel, the mighty mass of the Weisshorn, the ponderous Brünnighorn, the tall and sinister, man-eating pyramid of the Cervin, and the Dent Blanche, the white tooth, treacherous and threatening. Finally, they saw far below, in a tremendous chasm, at the bottom of a fearsome abyss, the town of Loach. The little houses looked like grains of sand scattered by some hand across the floor of this giant defile, which was closed on one side by the Gemmi Pass, and, far below on the other, opened out towards the Rhone itself. The mules stopped at the path, which twisted like a snake, winding in fantastical curve along the steep mountainside, descending right down to the base, to the tiny, almost invisible town. The women dismounted into the snow. The two older men, the family patriarch and the grizzled guide, approached them. Jean Hauser clasped his companion's hands firmly. "Well, stand fast, friends. Until next year." Gaspard Hari nodded silently in reply. "Until we meet again." The men embraced, exchanging a threefold kiss. Then it was the women's turn. First Madame Hauser, and then Louise after her, offered their wind-chilled cheeks. When the farewells reached Ulrich, he leaned close to Louise's ear and whispered hoarsely, "Remember those who remain up here." "I won't forget," she breathed in reply. So faintly he read the words on her lips more than heard them. "Farewell," Jean Hauser called after them, already moving past the women. "Take care of yourselves." And so the three of them began their perilous descent, soon disappearing behind the first sharp bend in the trail. The two remaining guides trudged slowly back toward the Schwarenbach Inn. They walked shoulder to shoulder, sunk in heavy silence. It was over. Now they faced 4, perhaps even 5 months of icy solitude, alone together. To lighten the oppressive atmosphere, old Hari began recounting his previous winter with Michel Canal, the very man now too aged for such ordeals. For who knows what might happen during months of complete isolation. Still, he assured Gaspard, they hadn't been bored. The key was to establish a good routine from the very first day. Then everything would fall into place, with both work and distractions to be found. Ulrich listened distractedly, eyes downcast, his thoughts following those now, winding their way down the pass's serpentine curves toward the warm, living town below. Soon the inn itself appeared against the endless snow plain, a tiny black speck on the dazzling white canvas. No sooner had they opened the door than Shaggy Sam came joyfully bounding out to meet them, wagging his tail and whining with delight. "Well, son," Gaspard sighed resignedly, "from now on, we can rely on no one but ourselves. Get to peeling the potatoes. It's time to think about supper." Settling on rough wooden stools, they began their simple meal, dipping stale bread into the steaming broth. The next morning felt endlessly drawn out to Ulrich. While old Hari took his time lighting his pipe and spitting into the fire, the young man stared fixedly out the window at the mountain opposite, blazing brilliantly in the sun. After noon, he went outside and, retracing yesterday's route, searched for the tracks of the mule that had carried the women away. Reaching the Gemmi Pass, Ulrich lay down at the cliff's edge and fixed his gaze on Loach. The small town, as if dropped into a stone well, was not yet locked in snow. The white shroud besieged it from all sides, but thick pine forest reliably protected the valley from the icy invasion. The little houses, like scattered pebbles, were lost in the green of the meadows. Louise Hauser was down there now, in one of those gray, indistinguishable from this height buildings. Which one? There was no way to make out any details. Oh, how he wanted to rush down before it was too late to descend to her. But the sun had already vanished behind the colossal mass of the wild Strubel, and the youth had to return. Old Hari still sat with his pipe, as if he hadn't moved since morning. Noticing his companion's return, he suggested whiling away the evening with cards, and they settled at the table. They played until supper, and then, after eating heartily, retired for the night. The following days, equally sunny, frosty, and windless, differed little from the first. Old Gaspard passed the evenings watching for eagles and other rare birds that occasionally ventured into these icy heights. Ulrich made his daily pilgrimage to the pass to look once more upon the town. Then they would sit down again to cards, dice, or dominoes, wagering trivial knickknacks, anything to relieve the monotony of their seclusion. But one morning, Hari, waking first, roused his partner. A fluffy, dense, yet weightless cloud of white dust settled soundlessly upon them, wrapping them on all sides in a heavy, icy shroud. This continued for 4 days and nights without respite. They had to dig out the doors and windows, tunnel through the corridor, and chop out steps to escape their frozen dungeon. For in just 12 hours of bitter frost, the snow had turned to stone, harder than granite. From then on, they lived like true prisoners, afraid to venture beyond the threshold. Having clearly divided the chores, each conscientiously performed his duties. Ulrich cleaned, washed, maintained order in the inn, and chopped wood. Gaspard Hari manned the stove, tending the fire. Their monotonous tasks were occasionally interrupted by a game of cards or dice. They never argued. Both were calm and even-tempered, showing neither irritation nor ill humor, having resigned themselves to their fate even before the long mountain winter began. From time to time, old Gaspar would take his trusty rifle and go hunting for chamois, occasionally returning with a prize quarry. On such evenings, a genuine celebration took hold at the Schwarenbach. They would feast on fresh meat sizzling in a pan, breaking the monotonous winter routine. On one such morning, he set out as usual. The mercury column of the thermometer stood fixed at 18 degrees below zero. The sun had not yet cleared the peaks, and the old hunter hoped to ambush game on the snow-laden slopes of the Wildstrubel. Left in complete solitude, Ulrich allowed himself to sleep until 10, an indulgence he would never have dared under the watchful eye of the old guide, famed for his early rising. Leisurely, he shared a modest breakfast with Sam, who spent his days and nights in a doze by the fire. But soon, a profound melancholy and a vague anxiety began to tighten around his heart. He even found himself missing their nightly card battles. Finally resolving to act, the young man left the house, intending to meet his comrade, who was due back by 4 o'clock. The snow had utterly consumed the valley, filling the crevasses, hiding both lakes under a white shroud, and enveloping the rock outcrops. Now, between the colossal peaks, there gaped only a vast white bowl, dazzling and lifeless. A full 3 weeks had passed since Ulrich last approached that cliff edge overlooking the town. And now, before heading towards the slopes of the Wildstrubel, he detoured there. Loach was now drowning in a snowy haze, and it was impossible to distinguish individual buildings under the dense white cover. Turning right, he came upon the tongue of the Lammern Glacier. Treading confidently like a born mountaineer, he tapped his iron-tipped staff against the packed, stone-hard snow crust. His eyes strained into the distance, searching the endless white expanse for a tiny blact. Right by the glacier, he paused, pondering whether the old man had taken this very path before striding off along the rocky ridge with quickened, anxious steps. The sun dipped toward the horizon, tinting the snow delicate shades of pink. An icy, biting wind swept across the crystalline plain in short, freezing gusts. Ulrich shouted with all his might, but his voice was swallowed by the dead silence of the sleeping mountains. It carried over the frozen ridges of the glacial sea like a lone bird's cry, and finally faded into the soundlessness. Nothing answered. He trudged onward. The sun had now vanished behind the jagged peaks, still crimson with the last remnants of light. Meanwhile, in the depths of the valley, darkness was gathering, and a primal fear suddenly seized the young man. He fancied that the very silence, this all-consuming solitude and the deadly cold of the mountains, was taking hold of him, freezing the blood in his veins, paralyzing his body, turning him into a motionless statue of ice. And he broke into a run, hurrying back towards the inn. The old man must have returned by now, while he was wandering. Surely Gaspard was sitting by the hearth, with a shot chamois lying beside him. There was the inn ahead. No smoke curled from the chimney. Ulrich quickened his pace, flung open the door. Sam came joyfully bounding towards him. But Gaspard was not there. The frightened youth feverishly scanned every corner, as if hoping to find his comrade lurking in some shadow. Then, trying to ward off his anxiety, he stoked the hearth and began preparing a broth. Deep down, a hope still flickered that the old man would return at any moment. Time and again, he stepped onto the threshold, peering into the advancing twilight. But Hari did not come back, and outside, night had now fallen, a dim, pale mountain night, on whose edge hung a thin yellow crescent moon, seeming ready to slip away and vanish behind the dark outlines of the peaks. Returning inside, Ulrich settled by the fire, warming his chilled hands and feet, while his mind swarmed with ever darker conjectures about the possible misfortune. Gaspard could have fallen into a crevasse, stumbled and sprained, or even broken his leg. And now he would be lying in the snow, slowly freezing to death, crying out in despair for help in the nocturnal silence, lost in this white desert. But where to even search? These colossal masses, so harsh and merciless, especially now in winter. To comb their boundless expanses would require a team of 10, even 20 experienced trackers, and no less than a week. Nevertheless, Ulrich Kunze was resolute. If Gaspard Hari had not returned by 1 in the morning, he himself would set out to search with Sam. He began his preparations. Into the rucksack went provisions for 2 days, steel hooks, a long, thin, yet incredibly sturdy rope coiled around his waist. He checked his iron-spiked staff and ice axe, then paused for a moment, his eyes sweeping over the familiar room. Logs crackled in the fireplace, casting shifting shadows. In their crimson glow, the large dog slept, softly snoring. With a monotonous beat, like a living heart, the old clock ticked within its polished wooden case. Ulrich waited, holding his breath, listening for every sound beyond the walls and flinching at every gust of wind that skimmed the roof. When the clock struck midnight, he shuddered. A cold dread rose in his throat. To warm himself and chase away the tremors, he set a pot of water on the fire, deciding to fortify himself with a mug of hot coffee before leaving. The moment the clock struck 1, he rose, roused Sam, swung the heavy door open, and headed towards the grim face of the Wildstrubel. 4 or 5 long hours he scrambled over the rocks, driving his hooks into the ice, forcing a path forward, sometimes hauling the dog up on the rope where the ascents proved too steep. Around 6 in the morning, he reached the coveted spot, the very grounds where old Gaspar usually lay in wait for chamois. Here he stopped to wait for dawn. The sky above his head gradually lightened, and suddenly a vague, phantom light, born from nowhere, spilled over all these pale giants soaring to the heavens. It seemed the very snow blanket emitted this phosphorescent glow, filling the air with it. Gradually, The highest peaks were tinted a delicate rose, and from behind the stern giants of the Bernese Alps, a crimson sun appeared. Ulrich pressed on. He walked, crouched like a true hunter, scanning for the faintest tracks and urging the dog. "Search, my friend, search. We'll find him." Now he was descending, peering intently into every gorge, and at times calling for help, but his voice vanished without a trace into the stony silence. Then he would press his ear to the ground, trying to catch the slightest sound. He fancied he heard cries. He would rush forward, call out again, but, receiving no answer, would sink exhausted onto the snow, gripped by despair. At noon, he managed a meager snack and shared the scant meal with the weary Sam. After a brief rest, he set off once more. By evening, he was still trudging on, having covered dozens of kilometers over mountain paths. It was too far to turn back, and he had no strength left to go forward. Digging a hole in the deep snow, he burrowed into it with the dog, wrapping himself in the blanket he had brought. So they lay, pressed against one another, man and beast, sharing their last warmth, and still growing numb from the piercing cold. Ulrich did not close his eyes. His mind was tormented by nightmares, and his body shook with a fine tremor. With the first hints of dawn, he rose. His legs were stiff and heavy, as if filled with lead. His spirit was so broken he felt like howling from hopelessness. His heart pounded so wildly it seemed ready to burst at any sound. And suddenly a thought pierced him. He would die here, in this icy desert, just as Gaspard likely had. The animal fear of such a death breathed new energy into him. Strength came from somewhere. He crawled in the direction of the inn, stumbling, falling, and rising again, while behind him, faithful Sam hobbled on 3 legs. They only staggered back to the Schwarenbach around 4 in the afternoon. The house stood empty and dark. The youth somehow got the fire going, hastily ate, and collapsed, powerless, sinking into a deep, heavy sleep devoid of thought or feeling. He slept for a very long time, dead to the world. But suddenly a voice, a desperate cry, "Ulrich!" tore him from the arms of oblivion. He sprang up as if scalded. A dream? Could such things happen? A call heard in an anxious sleep? No, he could still hear it, this piercing shriek, invading his ears, filling his entire body, reaching to his fingertips. Someone had shouted. Someone had called him. Ulrich! Someone was there, right nearby, beyond the wall. Of this he had no doubt. He flung the door open and screamed into the night, straining his last reserves of strength. "Is that you, Gaspard?" In reply, not a sound. No answer, no whisper, no groan. Only impenetrable darkness and the pale glimmer of snow. A wind rose, an icy breath of mountain frost that shatters stone and leaves nothing living atop these God-forgotten peaks. Its gusts were more parching and deadly than the scorching breath of the desert. Ulrich screamed again, pouring all his pain and despair into the cry. "Gaspard! Gaspard! Gaspopper!" He stood frozen, waiting, but the mountains maintained their tomb-like silence. An icy horror pierced him to the marrow. With a jerk, he darted back inside the inn, slammed the door shut with force, drove the massive bolt home, and collapsed exhausted into an armchair, absolutely certain it had been his comrade's death cry. This certainty ate into his consciousness. Old Gaspard Hari had been dying for 2 long days and 3 endless nights somewhere in a stone fissure, in one of those icy maws whose deathly whiteness is more terrible than the utter blackness of dungeons. He had died in agony, breathing his last just a moment ago, thinking of his partner. And now his soul, newly freed, had raced to the lonely inn where Ulrich slept and called to him, obeying that mystical and dreadful force that compels the souls of the departed to relentlessly haunt the living. This mute soul had screamed into the slumbering man's oppressed mind, pouring into that call a final farewell, a last reproach, and a curse for the one who had searched for him so carelessly. Ulrich felt physically that Gaspard's soul was here, very close, just beyond the thin wall, beyond the very door he had just slammed. It fluttered outside, like a night moth beating against the glass of a lit window, and the youth, now on the verge of madness, felt ready to howl with the fear consuming him. He desperately wanted to flee, but was terrified to cross the threshold. He didn't dare, and would never dare again to go out, for the specter would wander here eternally, finding no peace until its body was found and laid to rest in the consecrated earth of a cemetery. With the coming of day, as the bright sun rose, Kunzi's despair receded somewhat, giving way to a grim resolve. He ate breakfast, fed his faithful dog, and remained sitting in his chair, thinking with a pained heart of the old man left lying in his icy prison. But no sooner had night swallowed the mountains than dark thoughts assailed him once more. He paced the dark kitchen, weakly lit by the flickering flame of a candle, striding from corner to corner with wide, nervous steps, straining to hear. Would that inhuman cry again slash through the oppressive silence? He knew loneliness. Perhaps no one had ever been so alone. He was alone in this boundless snowy void, alone at a dizzying height, above the world of men, above noisy, bustling life, lost in the freezing heavens. A wild, uncontrollable desire to flee seized him. Anywhere, anyhow, to plunge down towards Loach, even if it meant throwing himself into the abyss. And he would have done it, but he dared not open the door. He was stopped by the fear that the dead man would not let him leave, afraid of being left in complete solitude among these silent giants. Around midnight, exhausted by sleeplessness and fear, he finally fell into a fitful sleep in his armchair, for the bed now seemed to him a haven for ghosts. And suddenly the piercing cry cut through the silence once more. It was so deafening that Ulrich instinctively threw his hands forward, as if warding off an invisible threat, and crashed to the floor along with the overturned chair. Sam, awakened by the noise, let out a wild howl, the kind only animals frightened to death can make. He raced around the room, trying to locate the source of the danger. Running to the door, he grew alert, sniffed, and emitted a low, threatening growl. The crazed Kunzi leapt to his feet, grabbed the chair by its leg, and screamed at the invisible visitor. "Don't come in. Don't you dare come in. I'll kill you, hear me?" The dog, excited by his master's fury, redoubled its barking at the unseen foe. Gradually, Sam calmed down and lay by the fire, but anxiety still held him. He lay with his head raised, quietly growling, baring his powerful fangs. Ulrich slowly came to his senses, but feeling that another moment would drive him insane with terror, he fetched a bottle of vodka from the cupboard and knocked back several glasses in quick succession. His mind grew foggy, his thoughts tangled, and a deceptive warmth and phantom courage spread through his veins. The next day, he didn't touch food, merely drinking on. Thus passed several days, lost in an alcoholic haze. The moment the image of Gaspard surfaced in his memory, he would grab the bottle again, until the liquor felled him. He lay face down, motionless as a corpse, his body broken, snoring, his forehead pressed to the cool floor. But as soon as the burning stupor was absorbed by his system, that same cry, Ulrich, would pierce his consciousness again, searing into his brain like a red-hot bullet. He would rise, staggering, thrusting his hands out for balance, and call Sam for help. And the dog, now nearly as mad as his master, would furiously attack the door, scratching it with his claws and sinking his mighty teeth into the wood. All the while, the youth, throwing his head back, would greedily gulp the vodka like life-giving water after a long thirst, the drink that granted him a few hours of oblivion, numbing his memory, his thoughts, and his clinging fear. In 3 weeks, he drank every last drop of the stored spirits. But the prolonged drunkenness only dulled the fear, which returned with tenfold strength the moment the intoxicating fog cleared. And then the obsessive thought of the dead man, sharpened by weeks of binge drinking and absolute solitude, would bore into his brain like a white-hot drill. He would begin to pace the room like a wild beast in a trap, press his ear to the door, listen to see if the other was still there, and scream at him through the thick wood. And then, as soon as his exhausted body sank into slumber, he would hear the voice again and start up as if scalded. Finally, one night, driven to the limit by despair and horror, he lunged for the door and threw it wide open, resolved to confront face to face the one who called him and force him into eternal silence. An icy gust struck his face, piercing him to the bone with a lethal chill. He slammed the door shut with force, through the heavy bolt, not even noticing in his haste that Sam had been left outside. Still trembling, he tossed an armful of wood onto the fire and sat down by the hearth, only to flinch immediately upon hearing a desperate scrabbling and pitiful, broken whimpers from behind the wall. "Go away!" he bellowed beside himself. From the darkness outside came a long, suffering moan in reply. In that moment, the last vestiges of his reason left him. "Go away! Go away!" he repeated, spinning madly on the spot, searching for a place to hide. And outside, the other continued to cry, wandering aimlessly around and rubbing against the walls. In a fit of madness, Ulrich attacked the massive oak sideboard, crammed full of provisions. Summoning all his strength, he shifted it from its place and barricaded the door with it. Then, dragging everything he could lay his hands on, broken furniture, mattresses, paillasses, chairs, he built a veritable barricade in front of the window, as if preparing for a long siege. Mournful lamentations came from beyond the wall, and soon the youth began to answer them with equally wild, animalistic groans. And so their days and nights passed, filled with this dreadful duet. One ceaselessly circled outside, scratching at the wall so ferociously it seemed the masonry itself would soon give way. The other, imprisoned within, pressed his ear to the wall, caught every sound, and answered it with a piercing, inhuman shriek. But one evening, silence fell behind the partition wall. Ulrich, exhausted to the limit, sank to the floor and immediately plunged into a heavy, death-like sleep. He awoke with a clear, rested head, remembering neither the previous horror nor himself. He was tormented by a ravenous hunger, and he greedily fell upon the food. Meanwhile, spring had come to the mountains. The Gemmi Pass was free of ice, and the Hauser family, as usual, made their way up to reopen for the summer season. Upon reaching the pass summit, the women mounted their mule, and their conversation naturally turned to the two guides they hoped to see at any moment. One thing troubled them all. Why had neither of the men come down a few days earlier, when the path became passable, to share news of the long winter. Finally, the inn came into view in the distance, still dusted with snow. The door and shutters were tightly closed, but a thin column of smoke rose from the chimney, a sight which somewhat reassured Hauser the father. However, drawing closer, he made out with horror the gnawed skeleton of a large animal on the doorstep, clearly torn apart by mountain eagles. "Why, that looks like Sam," the mother whispered, her voice tight. "Hey, Gaspard," she called out loudly toward the house. In reply, from behind the door, came a deafening, piercing roar, more bestial than human. "Gaspard!" The father shouted again, more anxiously now, and again the same wild howl was his only answer. Hauser and his sons tried to break down the door, but the sturdy planks held fast. They had to go to the empty stable and fetch a heavy log. Several concerted blows, and the wood gave way with a splintering crunch. Following the crash, a commotion was heard inside, and in the doorway, behind the overturned sideboard, they saw a strange creature, an overgrown man with hair to his shoulders and a matted beard to his waist, with feverishly bright eyes, clad in nothing but filthy rags. His features were unrecognizable, but Louise Hauser, crying out, was the first to identify him. "Mama, it's Ulrich." The mother, looking closer, agreed, though the thick gray streaking his hair made him unrecognizable. He allowed them to approach, even to touch him, but to all their questions he answered only with senseless muttering. They had to take him down to Loach, where the doctors, after examining him, unanimously concluded insanity. And so, no one ever learned what fate had befallen his companion. And as for young Louise, that summer she nearly died of a strange, wasting sickness, which the local folk attributed to the pernicious influence of the mountain cold.